With China recently unveiling its new stealth aircraft in testing, and the future of America's own next-generation air dominance fighter still uncertain, the Air Force released its 22-page vision of the future of air warfare in a newly released report entitled simply The Department of the Air Force in 2050. This report highlights the rapidly changing landscape of air warfare, including the need for a fundamental shift in the way the United States goes about designing and procuring new combat aircraft like fighters, emphasizing the need to dramatically increase both the number and range of new jets entering service due to the persistent and growing threat of long-range cruise and ballistic missile strikes on forward air bases. And those aren't the only threats the Air Force is concerned about, with predictions of adversaries fielding air defense interceptors that can bring down aircraft at 1,000-mile ranges, China's nuclear arsenal ballooning to thousands of warheads, and the growing possibility of conventional missile strikes on the US mainland. The Air Force paints a picture of America at a crossroads, with two potential paths forward. The first is a Defense Department and lawmaker class that continues to resist change, that keeps old and obsolete weapons and aircraft in service well beyond their useful lifespans for political reasons, and that aims to win the next big conflict by preparing for the last one. This path, the Air Force warns, will lead to an outdated air power apparatus in 2050 that looks a lot like the one the Air Force has in service today. But the Air Force also outlines another possible path, one that's willing to embrace fundamental changes in the way America conducts air warfare, from the earliest stages of designing new systems all the way to their employment on the battlefield. Put simply, the United States can no longer keep kicking this can down the road and must decide now which future its Air Force will fight in. One where the nation's aging air power apparatus struggles to address tomorrow's threats using yesterday's equipment, or one where America leans into emerging technologies the same way it did in the 20th century, not arriving at the future of air warfare, but rather shaping it themselves. So let's talk about the Air Force in 2050, the challenges that it'll face, and how the branch believes it can fight and win in the future. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Iran has officially unveiled its first drone carrier, dubbed Marder Baman Baghari. According to Iranian state media reports, this ship can carry as many as 60 drones and operate at sea for up to a year at a time, though as a repurposed commercial vessel that would absolutely require fairly complex replenishments at sea for both fuel and all the stuff required to support its crew. And I've been staying on top of this story thanks to Ground News. Ground News is an aggregator that collects articles published by news outlets all around the world and places them all into a single easy-to-read feed, making it simpler than ever to not just stay on top of what's going on in the world, but also to peer through the veil of bias that's so common in today's news media. Right here on Ground News, I can see that only 22 outlets have covered the story since it broke earlier today, including 6 left-leaning outlets and 6 right-leaning ones. Some left-leaning outlets seem to be playing up the potential threat posed by this new ship, with headlines like, Iran unveils largest naval military project to date, Marder Baman Baghari, whereas some right-leaning outlets are instead emphasizing Iran's piecemeal approach to construction, with headlines like, Iran unveils scrap heap challenge-style warship built from old cargo vessel. Ground News also shows you vital information about each outlet, along with the headlines, like their political bias, their factuality rating, corporate ownership, or government affiliations. And I love the Ground News blind spot feature that shows me news stories that are getting lots of attention in one political sphere and not in the other. It helps me make sure I'm keeping my media intake balanced. Ground News is a big part of my research and my day-to-day news consumption, and it can be for you too. In fact, I can get you a great deal. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's, or follow the link in the description below to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan that'll help you stay on top of things. On December 26, 2024, 2 new stealth aircraft were photographed being tested over China, prompting a flood of media coverage and rampant speculation about the capabilities these jets could provide the Pacific nation, and how these hypothetical threats stack up against America's existing ability to defend against them. As we've discussed on this channel before, that discourse was, for the most part, more about internet hyperbole and sensationalism than a concrete understanding of what these platforms would ultimately be able to do. After all, these test flights may point to China's air warfare priorities, but even the most optimistic timelines still place them years away from service, if indeed they ever even get there. But while it's important not to overstate the significance of these new developments, it's just as important not to understate them either. During my recent trip to NORAD and Spacecom a few months ago, this was among the few points echoed throughout every meeting I attended. Now, I wasn't allowed to record while on premises, but to paraphrase how this point was conveyed, it went something like, China is not the Taliban. They are a well-funded and highly motivated adversary with significant resources and rapidly expanding capabilities to bring to bear. Now, this point was often followed by another, even more unnerving statement that Northcom values so much they painted it on the wall. The homeland is no longer a sanctuary, and the Air Force's assessment of the next quarter century in air warfare echoes this sentiment directly in a number of important ways. I'll quote the report now. China's massive investment in air, land, and sea-launched medium-range systems and systems that reach the so-called second island chain and beyond have already put traditional Air Force systems and operating concepts at risk. We can only expect this trend to continue. In 2050, we should expect to be under threat of ultra-long-range precision weapons at any range and launched from any domain, including space. There will be no sanctuary from these weapons. While the Air Force is focused on maintaining America's warfighting edge in the air power domain, their analysis of the threat environment in 2050 includes further reaching threats than those posed by fighters, bombers, and long-range missiles. I'll quote the report again. Even a largely localized conflict will come to the U.S. homeland, and not only through the possible use of long-range precision kinetic weapons against our territory. Critical military and non-military infrastructure, as well as human cognition itself, will be at risk of kinetic and non-kinetic attack in cyber and information domains. This will affect military operations conducted by the Air Force and Space Force, but also have a broader societal impact. In other words, the Air Force paints a stark picture of military competition in 2050. One defined not by highly maneuverable fighters squaring off in dynamic dogfights, but rather by long-range munitions raining havoc down on once seemingly out-of-reach targets with enough precision and regularity to upend America's current approach to force projection. Even in the air, a domain long dominated by the United States, the Air Force views establishing lasting air superiority over contested regions of the globe in 2050 as something that may only be achievable in localized areas for short periods of time, with air assets being used to police these spaces under constant threat from rapidly advancing surface-to-air missiles. As the Air Force sees it, forward-located fixed air bases where the United States can mass air power for prolonged combat operations will no longer be a viable option, as long-range strikes mounted by ballistic, cruise, and hypersonic missiles alongside armed kamikaze drones will turn them into turkey shoots, with American aircraft destroyed on the airstrip long before they ever even enter the fight. I'll quote the report again. Air forces that depend on a small number of easily targeted forward air bases will not be viable in 2050 and may not be viable today. Similarly, counter-air weapons with ranges out to over 1,000 miles and supported by space-based sensors will place aircraft such as tankers that have traditionally operated with impunity at risk. Now, it's worth noting that surface-to-air missiles with 1,000-mile ranges would represent a massive change in how air defense operations play out. And as that report highlights, they would all but certainly have to be supported through space-based sensors in order to be viable. Today's most advanced air defense systems often rely on multiple radar arrays broadcasting on different frequencies to identify, track, and eventually target threats at ranges into the hundreds of miles. But line of sight and the curvature of the Earth make extending that reach much further with surface-based radars pretty unlikely. Russia's S-400 Triumph, for instance, derives the 400 in its name from the maximum engagement range of its longest-legged interceptor, the 40N6, at roughly 400 kilometers, or around 250 miles. Even the newer S-500, which is allegedly already in limited service, can't reach targets further out than that, despite claiming an increased targeting range out to 600 kilometers, or around 372 miles, because Russia has yet to field an interceptor with greater range than the S-400's 40N6 missile for the S-500 to launch. China also employs Russian-sourced S-400 air defense systems, as well as its own HQ-9 series, which can be thought of as a sort of amalgamation of the Russian S-300 that it was based on, and command and control systems derived from American and Israeli air defense systems, sourced through a combination of espionage and the purchase of dual-use technologies from Western companies. Despite the commonalities between these systems, Russian and Chinese air defenses come with different strengths and weaknesses, with Russian systems generally believed to be more integrated with one another, but China's more broadly distributed and generally more mobile. Neither nation, however, currently has the publicly disclosed means to engage airborne threats from any greater than 250 miles or so at best, or to even be able to identify them at greater ranges than maybe 370 or so miles. But the Air Force clearly believes one, if not both of these nations, will be able to quadruple their interceptor range and marry that capability to precision target tracking from space-based sensors within the next 2.5 decades. Long-range precision targeting of forward air bases, along with the ability to shoot down encroaching aircraft at 1,000-mile ranges, the Air Force believes will force a shift in America's air warfare doctrine to achieving air superiority only episodically, as they put it, through what they call pulsed operations. Now, this is a dramatic departure from long-standing Air Force doctrine, and in a weird way, echoes Soviet air warfare doctrine first established during the Cold War, which was predicated on the acknowledgement that the Soviets couldn't mass sufficient air power to beat NATO in the sky, and instead would focus on securing airspace around combat operations and then ceding it again when no longer needed. This approach, however, has proven very ineffective over Ukraine, despite Russia's vast numerical and technological advantages, as demonstrated by Ukraine's ability to continue to not only operate a wide variety of tactical aircraft now about 3 years into this conflict, but just as importantly, to hold Russian fighters and bombers at continuous risk. That similarity shouldn't necessarily be seen as faulty logic on behalf of the Air Force, though, and instead might just highlight how immense overcoming this challenge can be. This seismic shift in the Air Force's envisioned doctrine, the 2050 report states, must come with a similarly significant change to the makeup of America's aircraft fleets. In such a future battle space, the Air Force sees relatively short-legged, but otherwise very capable fighters, like even the F-22 Raptor, as increasingly irrelevant. I'll quote the report again. Penetrating bombers will still have utility for nuclear deterrence, but large numbers of penetrating bombers escorted by fighters capable of penetrating heavily defended airspace will have limited utility, especially given the potential availability of cost-effective standoff and loitering weapons. While the reasoning behind this assessment isn't off base, it does sound uncomfortably like similar assessments put forth in the 50s and 60s, as intercontinental ballistic missiles seem to render America's bomber and fighter fleets unnecessary. After all, if you can take out a target from the other side of the globe with a single missile, why bother building aircraft to fly all the way there and duke it out in the sky? However, this is one area where I'm inclined to disagree with the Air Force's conclusions. In 25 years, China may indeed have sufficient long-range strike capabilities to force the United States to operate over strategic rather than tactical ranges. But in a world that'll still have literally thousands of fourth-generation fighters in service all across the globe, as well as the inevitable localized conflicts breaking out that don't present the same degree of threat environment America might find in a war with China, massing a stockpile of single-use munitions with specific capabilities tailored for a high-end fight makes as little sense in 2050 as it does today. Aircraft, whether crewed or uncrewed, not only offer much greater flexibility than single-use munitions, they also offer important reusability, dramatically bringing down the cost of delivering ordnance to targets. Drone swarms, for instance, may be very effective at engaging certain types of targets, but they're not reusable, meaning the question isn't how many drones can you buy for the price of an F-35, but rather, how many drones would you need to buy to engage as many targets as a single F-35 can throughout its 8,000-hour service life? Likewise, building a massive stockpile of high-end, low-observable, single-use missiles will always present a greater cost than building reusable aircraft capable of delivering much lower-cost munitions to their target areas. America's longest-ranged cruise missiles in service today, weapons like the Tomahawk, with a range of better than 1,500 miles, or even a conventionally armed variant of the still-in-development AGM-181 long-range standoff weapon, each ring in at multiple millions of dollars apiece, and based on the Air Force's own assessments, likely don't offer enough range to be launched from relative safety in the years ahead. Now, that high cost is due in large part to the fact that these weapons need to carry sufficient air-breathing propulsion systems and fuel stores to cover that distance. They need advanced onboard guidance capabilities to reach far-flung target areas with precision. And they need to carry their own low observable design characteristics, stealth coatings, and sometimes even countermeasures, all just to be destroyed upon impact with the target. An F-35 flying into contested airspace could theoretically take out similar targets with a $200,000 small-diameter bomb 3 times a week for the next 20 years, with a lower cost of operations and much less strain on America's industrial capacity. Now, this is, of course, not to suggest that long-range munitions of these sorts aren't vital for the future of American warfighting endeavors, but rather that an economically viable warfighting strategy can't place too much reliance on high-end single-use munitions, lest America risk depleting those stockpiles against lesser adversaries in low-intensity conflicts, or worse, risk losing a war, a financial attrition against an adversary like China. A balanced mix of munitions and delivery methods allows for a greater array of options for commanders in the fight, a more cost-effective approach to weapons delivery when appropriate, and a more distributed production load on American manufacturing. However, despite my reservations about the Air Force's reliance on long-range missiles, I can't dispute the validity of their next point, which is that the Air Force is going to have to transition away from maintaining large numbers of tactical jets and small numbers of long-range aircraft to the inverse, maintaining a smaller number of short-range jets and much larger numbers of long-range platforms. Now, according to public records, in 2024, the U.S. Air Force, including the Air Force Reserves, maintained a total long-range bomber fleet of 141 aircraft, including 45 B-1B Lancers and 20 B-2 Spirits, already slated for retirement in the 2030s, and 58 B-52s, each providing unrefueled combat ranges of between 3,000 and maybe 7,000 miles. Now, these bombers account for about 2.6% of the branch's total number of aircraft. And with 100 B-21 Raiders currently on order to replace retiring Lancers and Spirits, this number will rise to 158, or about 3%. Now, conversely, in 2024, the Air Force also maintained a fleet of 2,093 fighters of various types, including the National Guard and Reserves. These aircraft represent the backbone of the Air Force's weapon delivery capabilities and offer combat ranges from as little as 340 miles in the case of the F-16C with a full combat load, to as much as around 790 miles in the F-15EX. In a stark contrast to the long-range bomber fleet, these aircraft account for just shy of 40% of the Air Force's aircraft inventory. Acknowledging the reality of long-range missile strikes holding forward air bases at risk, and 1,000-mile interceptors making tanker operations too dangerous anywhere near Chinese shores, there's simply no getting around the fact that America's fighters don't offer enough range to continue to serve as the backbone of the force in the future environment that the Air Force envisions. According to the report, this issue can be addressed by retiring older fighter aircraft that aren't viable for future fights, platforms like the A-10 Thunderbolt II, increasing procurement of long-range platforms like the B-21 or a follow-on design beyond the 100 currently on order, and in the near term, relying more on standoff weapon releases from transport or cargo aircraft, which one could argue is a direct reference to Lockheed Martin's Rapid Dragon concept in all but name. The report also highlights the importance of continuing to advance technologies meant to allow for greater survivability in these long-range platforms, or even fielding entirely new ones as the threat environment changes. This focus on extremely long-range operations could possibly even explain some of the backroom hesitance to move forward with the Air Force's next-generation air dominance fighter, as one formerly high-ranking official who I won't name out of respect for them, recently told me that once you extend the range requirements for a fighter like NGAD to a certain point, the requisite size of the aircraft, due to fuel storage alone, starts skirting into bomber territory. And with a new multi-role bomber already moving into production that realistically is capable of serving as the same command node for forthcoming AI-enabled drone fighters, the price point of that big bomber-sized fighter starts to look less and less appealing. To put it simply, on a long enough timeline, the Air Force seems to believe all combat aircraft will become bombers of a sort. Now, after spending all this time talking about just how ill-prepared the Air Force believes it is for the fights of 2050, it is important to remember two things. The first is that accurately predicting the future of warfare is all but impossible, and the best we can do with our big monkey brains is to look at current trends and extrapolate from there. The second is that these reports are, to some extent, pessimistic for a purpose. The goal of these reports, like war games with the rules stacked to the adversary's advantage, is to prompt the change necessary to ensure America enters into conflict with a power overmatch that all but guarantees victory, and adversary actions simply determining the ultimate cost of that win. So, while the structure, the makeup, and even the doctrine of American air warfare may need to change in the coming years, the one thing the Air Force sees as staying the same, even in the face of all of these changes, is America's ability to fight and win in the sky. And as for whether or not they're ultimately right, I guess only time will tell. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.